Chapters 17 and 18 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 17. 1804 to 1809. Daily Life of the Empress. Abandoning for a moment the chronological sequence of events, let us endeavor to depict Josephine's mode of life during the time that her career was linked with the Empire. From the 18th of May, 1804, when she was saluted as Empress at Saint-Cloud, to the 15th of December, 1809, when her marriage was dissolved at the Tuileries. To Frédéric Masson of the Académie Française we owe many interesting details of the existence of the Empress at this time. During these 5 years and a half, Josephine passed less than 12 months in all at the Tuileries. She lived 13 months at Saint-Cloud, 8 at Malmaison, and 4 at Fontainebleau. She went twice to Plombières and once to Aix-la-Chapelle for the baths. She lived 6 months at Strasbourg and 4 at Mayence. She visited Germany, Italy, and Belgium, the borders of the Rhine, and all of the center and south of France. To follow her in her journeys, to trace her itinerary, would be both tedious and unprofitable. Wherever she lived her surroundings were practically the same, and the details of her daily life never varied. In the endeavor to emancipate himself from a part of the slavery to which the sovereigns of France had always submitted, Napoleon divided his existence into 2 parts. One, the exterior, which belonged to the public; the other, the interior, which was intimate and private. The first had for its theater the state apartments; the second was passed in the private rooms. But for the Empress this division was more apparent than real. The 2 lives were constantly overlapping. Now that the Tuileries have been destroyed for 50 years, it is difficult to give any clear idea of the apartments occupied by Josephine, and especially so as she was continually changing the arrangement of the rooms. The appartement d'honneur of the Empress was entered from the Carrousel at the corner of the Pavillon de Flore. The windows in the salons were so high from the floor that a person when seated could not see out. But Napoleon would allow no alterations made, as it would have injured the appearance of the façade of the palace. On the other side, the private rooms, which faced on the gardens, were only separated from the public sidewalk by a low terrace, and it was possible for any passer-by to see into the windows. Again, the Emperor refused to have any change made which would have deprived the Parisians of the privilege of passing through the gardens. It was not until the days of the People's King, Louis Philippe, that the windows were cut down and a part of the gardens was reserved. The private apartment of Josephine comprised only a library, a bedroom, a dressing room, and bathroom. All these rooms on the ground floor faced on the gardens, and were the same that Josephine and Hortense had occupied when they first came to the Tuileries. The personal suite of the Emperor on the first floor was reached by several private staircases, one of which ascended from Josephine's bedchamber. These stairways were so narrow that 2 persons could not pass. The rooms on the gardens were separated from those on the court by a long dark corridor. Above a part of Josephine's suite there was a mezzanine floor, or entresol, in which were located her wardrobes. The decorations of her apartment, made at the beginning of the Consulate, had never pleased Josephine, who wished above all to have a handsome bedroom. Accordingly, when she was absent in Germany in 1806, her rooms were entirely redecorated and refurnished by Fontaine in a truly imperial style, at a cost of 100,000 francs. But Josephine considered the work frightful, and a year later gave orders to have it all done over to suit her own taste. In the budget of 1808, the Emperor allowed a credit of 60,000 francs for this work, but the final cost exceeded 250,000. This time the architects, discouraged by so many contradictory orders, decided to follow their own ideas. When Josephine returned from Bayonne, the work was all finished. She was furious because her orders had been disregarded. The decorations were heavy and out of style. The furniture was too plain and too cheap. She went to live at the Élysée, and with her numerous absences from Paris, never again occupied the Tuileries for more than 3 months up to the day of her divorce. At the time of his second marriage, therefore, Napoleon did not think it necessary to make any great alterations for Marie Louise in the rooms which Josephine had hardly used. The arrangement of Josephine's rooms at Saint-Cloud was very similar to that at the Tuileries. except that they were located on the first floor, and were decorated in a more modern and more feminine style. Napoleon, who liked everything severe but handsome, was not pleased with the furniture, which he did not consider in accord with the majesty of his person and his reign. He said that Josephine's apartment was fit only for a fille entretenue. Most of the visitors did not agree with this opinion. They considered the rooms in good taste, and much pleasanter than those in the Tuileries. On the walls were hung many fine paintings, taken from the Musée Napoleon. In the salon of the Empress there was a handsome portrait of Madame Mère by Geer. But what attracted the most attention was a large mirror in one piece over the mantel. This was mounted on a back of solid silver, which disappeared when a spring was pressed, and furnished a fine perspective of the park with the fountains, the vases, and statues. The chamber of Josephine was particularly attractive, with the bed in the form of a small boat, of mahogany ornamented with gilded bronze, and mirrors on all sides. The bathroom was entirely in marble, with painted antique friezes. At St. Cloud the etiquette was somewhat relaxed and the life more private. It was possible to walk in the restricted gardens, and to make extended excursions in carriages, through the park and in the neighborhood, particularly to Malmaison. To give an idea of the tastes and occupations of Josephine, we will trace briefly the routine of one day. If the Emperor had passed the night in her apartment, he rose at 8 o'clock, and at Paris ascended, or at St. Cloud descended to his own rooms. Only at St. Cloud there was no private staircase, and he was forced to pass through a long corridor to reach the public stairway. Then the Empress's women entered and drew the curtains. For her first repast, Josephine drank in bed a cup of infusion or a lemonade. She always wore a nightcap of percale or embroidered muslin trimmed with lace. Although she had no end of night dresses, she usually wore a chemise over which at night she put on a camisole. The door was then opened for the entrance of her favorite pug dog, Fortuné, an ugly mongrel cur. This was a successor to the dog of the same name under whose collar she concealed her letters at the Carme in 1794. That one had been killed at Montebello. Never later than 9 o'clock, Josephine enters her dressing room, where she always passes at least 3 hours of her day, for she never neglects the mysterious rites of her toilette. Under the Empire, Josephine had no less than 12 attendants to care for her person and her wardrobe, but the 2 premières femmes were only there for the etiquette, and had few functions to perform beyond drawing their salary of 6,000 francs. The 4 femmes de chambre were pretty young girls, who after the end of 1805 were called dames d'annonce. 2 of them were in service every other week, and their duty was to announce to the Empress the persons who called upon her. Their salary was 3,000 francs a year. The real attendants of Josephine were the garde d'atour, Madame Mallet, and the 4 femmes de garde-robe, of whom one was Mademoiselle Aversion, who in her mémoire calls herself première femme de chambre de l'impératrice. These women were the ones who entered into the familiarity of the Empress, and were most in her confidence. To them Josephine entrusted not only her jewels and her robes, but also her most secret thoughts. To them she made presents of 500 or 1,000 francs at a time, gave them dots when they were married, and a pension when they retired. While guarding her rank, Josephine always treated these attendants with the greatest kindness and politeness, and naturally she was adored by them. For Josephine the rites of her toilette were long and complicated. She always took a bath every day, which was rather unusual at that time. But the most important act was to faire sa tête, to efface the ravages of time. In those days it was customary for all society women to employ rouge, but Josephine carried it to excess. Not content with putting a little on her cheeks, she covered her entire face with powder and rouge. The eye of Napoleon was so accustomed to this excess of color that he thought any woman who did not show it must be ill. "Go on and put on some rouge, madame," he said to one. "You look like a corpse." On the other hand, Napoleon could not endure the scent of any perfume except a little lavender water or eau de Cologne. The intricate details of her toilette completed, Josephine dresses for the morning. From her 500 chemises, she selects one of muslin, percale, or batiste, embroidered at the bottom and trimmed at the neck and sleeves with Malines or Valenciennes. The plainest ones cost 100 francs, and some of them 3 times that amount. As Josephine changes all her linen 3 times a day, the number of the garments is not so extraordinary. She almost always wears white silk stockings, costing from 20 to 70 francs a pair. No garters, as the new silk stockings stay in place. In the morning she puts on house shoes of taffetas or satin, at 8 francs the pair, of which she orders over 500 a year. She usually wears a light corset of lined percale trimmed with Valenciennes, for which she pays about 40 francs. After the corset she puts on a flimsy petticoat of percale trimmed with her favorite lace. That is all, absolutely all. Josephine n'a dans sa garde-robe que 2 pantalons en soie de couleur chair pour monter à cheval. When Josephine has put on a peignoir, her coiffeur, Herbeau, is introduced. He is an important personage in embroidered costume, with a sword by his side, and receives in salary and gifts 8,000 francs a year. But Herbeau is only employed on ordinary occasions. For days of ceremony there is Duplan, who is paid 12,000 francs, and later, in the time of Marie Louise, receives the magnificent salary of 42,000 francs. It is impossible to attempt to describe the coiffure employed by Josephine, for they varied from day to day. Her hair was of a decidedly auburn shade, and in color and thickness remained the same to the end of her life. After these first details, which had consumed much time, there was a regular council of war as to the robe, the hat, and the wrap to be selected. In summer her dresses were of muslin, batiste, or percale, and she had over 200 to select from. In winter she wore cloth or velvet gowns, of which she had no less than 600 or 700 in her wardrobe. To wear with these costumes there were endless wraps of every possible material, mostly trimmed with the rarest and most expensive furs. Josephine always wore a hat in the morning, and frequently also in the evening. Her choice was limited to 250, all different in form, color, and trimming. Twice a year she went carefully through her wardrobe and gave away a large part of her collection. Most of the articles, some of which she had never used, were presented to her femme de chambre. But even Madame Mère and the Queens of Naples and Westphalia did not disdain to accept such gifts. In 6 years Josephine spent for her wardrobe the enormous sum of 1.5 millions, and this did not include accounts not settled, or costumes for ceremonies like the coronation, for which the Emperor made her a special allowance. In addition, during the same period, she spent over 5 million francs for jewelry. When Napoleon, after her divorce, paid up all her debts, her total expenditures for the 6 years reached the enormous total of 6,647,580 francs, or an average of more than 1 million francs a year. When we consider that the Empress had the use of the finest crown jewels in the world, valued at over 5 millions, it is difficult to understand why she made all these purchases for her own private collection. Her motive does not seem to have been to accumulate a reserve, for use in case of necessity, but rather a real mania for spending money. Her collection, which she left to Hortense, was appraised after her death at over 4 million francs, which was probably a third less than the actual value. We have at first hand the story of the scene which preceded the first payment of her debts in 1806. Josephine came to the table with tears in her eyes. Napoleon leaned over and whispered to her, "Well, madame, you are in debt?" No reply except a sob. "You owe 1 million?" "No, sire. I swear that I only owe 600,000. "Only that, you say? Does that seem to you only a bagatelle?" He adds a few words of reproach, and she begins to sob louder than ever. Then he whispers again, "Come, Josephine. Come, my little one, do not cry. Compose yourself." And the debts are paid. After she was dressed, Josephine received her physician. She had a constitution of iron, and was rarely ill, but she was a malade imaginaire, and was always taking medicine. Corvisart, the chief physician of the Emperor, generally succeeded in curing her by a prescription made up of bread pills. At 11 o'clock precisely, for she was punctuality personified, Josephine entered the Salon Jaune, where were introduced the ladies she had invited for déjeuner. The menu, which was usually prepared for 10 persons, comprised a soup, tout relevé, 6 entrées, 2 roasts, 6 entremets, and 6 dishes of dessert. A bottle of Beaune and 2 bottles of fine Bourgogne were served. Coffee was taken at the table, and a half bottle of liqueur was provided. Josephine, who ate but little, did the honors with charming courtesy, drawing out her guests to tell her all the latest gossip of the city and the court, which the Emperor was always interested in hearing repeated. Napoleon usually took a hasty breakfast on a little table in his cabinet, but sometimes he came down and joined his wife's party. After breakfast, Josephine returned to the salon. To walk in the gardens was impossible, and the only exercise she took at Paris was an occasional game of billiards. She rarely read anything, and never called upon her ladies to read for her. But she was fond of conversation, and there was always someone with whom to talk. At 5 o'clock Josephine went to her rooms to change her toilette for dinner, which was served at the early hour of 6 o'clock. She changed completely, and selected an evening gown which was always very décolleté. In the evening she always wore a great many jewels. Her toilette finished, Josephine waits for the Préfet du Palais to announce that the Emperor is ready to go to dinner. Sometimes, absorbed in his work, Napoleon forgets that he has not dined, and she waits 1 hour, 2, occasionally 3 or 4. She is never impatient, and never disturbs Napoleon at his work. She passes the time in conversation with her ladies. When the Emperor is ready, she goes to the room where the dinner is served, sometimes in her apartment, and sometimes in that of Napoleon on the floor above. At Paris they usually dined alone, except Sundays, when there was a family party. After dinner Napoleon always went to Josephine's salon, where she herself served the coffee. Unless they were going out to the theatre, or there was a ball, concert, or spectacle at the chateau, which happened about twice a week, the Emperor remained for a short time and talked with any dignitaries who had called. He then returned to his cabinet, and Josephine passed the evening in conversation, or in a game of backgammon or whist, both of which games she played remarkably well. Quite often the Emperor, after he had retired for the night, sent for her to read to him, as he loved the sound of her voice. As soon as he was asleep, she returned to her salon and resumed her game. At midnight all visitors departed, and Josephine made her toilette for the night, which took nearly as long as that of the morning. In this also she was elegant, said the Emperor. She was graceful even in going to bed. 1805. Italy and Strasbourg. On the 2nd of April, 1805, Napoleon left Fontainebleau for Milan, where he was to be crowned as King of Italy. He had not intended to take Josephine with him, but she pleaded so warmly that he finally yielded. The first night was spent at Troyes, and the following day the Emperor went alone to Brienne, to see the school where he had received his first education. He slept at the chateau, and the following morning, without any escort, he visited the old familiar scenes of his boyhood. Following the usual route via Mâcon, the imperial party reached Lyons a week later. In order not to fatigue the Empress, Napoleon had arranged to stop every night in some city, instead of traveling night and day as was his regular habit. The sovereigns usually stayed at the Prefecture, where they found the dinner ready to serve, and the lodgings prepared by the servants sent in advance. At Lyons they descended at the palace of the Archbishop, Cardinal Fesch, who had recently been appointed to this see. The entire journey from Fontainebleau had been a triumphal march. The villagers had flocked from far and near to line the route and cheer their Emperor, with an enthusiasm which at that time was as sincere as it was spontaneous. It was 3 hours after noon when the party entered Lyons, and the entire populace of the second city of France had gathered to acclaim the Emperor. Napoleon had done much to increase the prosperity of this large silk manufacturing town, and he was extremely popular there. After a sojourn of 5 days they left for Turin by way of Mont-Cenis. The fine road over the Alps, constructed by Napoleon, was not yet completed, and to cross the mountains, chaises à porteurs were provided for the women and mules for the men. The Pope, who had left Fontainebleau 2 days after the Emperor, was still at Turin, where he had stopped for a short rest on his way to Rome. As he occupied the palace, the Emperor deferred for several days his entry into the capital, and stopped at an old villa of the King of Sardinia a few miles from the city. Before proceeding to Milan, the party turned aside to visit Alessandria. Here, the 5th of May, the Emperor held a grand review on the field where 5 years before he had gained the great victory of Marengo. He had brought from Paris, and wore again on this occasion, the old and faded uniform, the shapeless hat, and the heavy sabre which recalled so many glorious memories. The manoeuvres were directed by Eugene under the orders of the Emperor, and Napoleon expressed to Josephine his satisfaction with the manner in which her son had performed his task. On the following day Napoleon saw Jérôme for the first time since his brother's marriage. Jérôme had arrived at Lisbon with his wife during the month of April. He was allowed to land, but under orders from the Emperor she was forced to re-embark for England. Jérôme was summoned to meet the Emperor in Italy, and travelled there post-haste. After a decisive interview with Napoleon, he basely agreed to abandon his wife and her unborn child, and was again restored to favor. On the 8th of May the Emperor entered Milan, where his welcome was not so spontaneous as in the cities of Piedmont. Napoleon was much disappointed at the lack of real enthusiasm, and spoke of it to Josephine. His coronation as King of Italy took place on the 26th May in the cathedral. The weather was perfect, and the city was crowded with spectators. The ceremonies were similar to those at Notre Dame, but on a much smaller scale. Cardinal Caprara, the Archbishop of Milan, officiated. Napoleon himself placed upon his head the celebrated iron crown of the ancient kings of Lombardy, at the same time using the traditional formula, "God gave it me, woe to him who touches it." Josephine, although she bore the title of Queen of Italy, was not crowned as at Paris, and was present at the ceremony only as a spectator. "After our return to the palace," writes Mademoiselle Aversion, "I was occupied in the room of the Empress when the Emperor entered. He was full of glee. He laughed, rubbed his hands together, and said with great good humor, 'Well, mademoiselle, did you have a good view of the ceremony? Did you hear what I said in placing the crown upon my head?' Then he repeated in nearly the same tone he had used in the cathedral, 'Dieu me l'a donné, gare à qui y touche.' I replied that nothing had escaped me. He was most amiable to me, and I have often remarked that when nothing disturbed the Emperor he was very familiar with the persons of his household. He spoke to us with a sort of bonhomie, of freedom, as if he were our equal. Often he gave us a little tap or pulled our ears. It was a favor which he did not accord to everybody, and we could judge of the extent of his good humor by the greater or less degree of pain that he caused us. Very frequently he did the same to the Empress when we were dressing her. He gave her some taps playfully upon the shoulders. It was useless for her to cry, 'Finis donc, Bonaparte.' He continued as long as the play amused him." On the 10th of June the Emperor announced the appointment of Eugene as Viceroy of Italy. This elevation of her son, which should have delighted Josephine, was only a cause of chagrin. She shed tears at the thought of being separated from her child. One day when the Emperor found her very sad, he said, "You weep, Josephine. It is not reasonable. Do you cry because you are going to be separated from your son? If the absence of your children causes you so much grief, judge what I myself must endure. The attachment to them which you show makes me cruelly feel the misfortune of not having any." These words were far from assuaging the grief of the Empress. They raised once more the dreaded spectre of divorce. Napoleon certainly had no idea of increasing her grief, and Josephine could not let him see what an interpretation she put upon his speech. "The Emperor," says Mademoiselle Aversion, "was one of the best husbands that I have ever known. When the Empress was indisposed, he passed by her side all the time that he could take from his affairs. He always came to her before retiring, and very often when he awoke during the night he came himself, or sent his Mameluke to have news of Her Majesty. He had for her the most tender regard, and it is only true to say that she fully returned it. Nothing that I say here would seem exaggerated if others, like myself, could have witnessed the proofs of affection which they both displayed. And I am certain that when political reasons forced them to separate, all the grief was not on one side." On the 10th of June the Emperor left Milan for a visit to the Austrian frontier and the famous Quadrilateral, the scene of so many of his brilliant victories. 3 days later he held another grand review of his troops on the battlefield of Castiglione. Josephine took advantage of his absence to make with a few attendants the tour of the Italian lakes. She was happy to be free for a few days from the irksome etiquette which the presence of the Emperor always imposed. On her return to Milan she dismissed most of her suite who were to leave directly for Paris, and with a few attendants proceeded to Bologna, where she rejoined the Emperor. In this city the new sovereigns of Italy received a very warm greeting, which partially atoned for the coldness of the Milanese. On the last day of June the party arrived at Genoa, well named the Superb, where they had a brilliant reception. During the following week there was a succession of magnificent fêtes to celebrate the incorporation of the ancient republic in the French Empire. Later, on the 6th of July, a special courier from Paris brought to the Emperor the news of the formation of the Third Coalition, and at 10 o'clock that evening he set out for Turin, where he arrived early on the following morning. He then told the Empress of his intention to start the next day post-haste for Paris, leaving her to follow him more leisurely. Josephine begged to accompany him, and the Emperor finally consented on her promise not to have one of her headaches. The party started in 3 carriages, one for the Emperor and Empress, another for the grand officers of the household, and a third for the service, with a small escort of cavalry. But after crossing Mont-Cenis, the Emperor traveled so rapidly that the other carriages and the escort were left far behind. Napoleon and Josephine reached Fontainebleau about 10 o'clock on the night of the 11th of July, after an absence of exactly 100 days. 4 days later the Emperor wrote to Jeanne, "I arrived 85 hours after my departure from Turin. Nevertheless, I lost 3 hours on Mont-Cenis, and I stopped constantly on account of the Empress. 1 or 2 hours to breakfast and 1 or 2 hours to dine made me lose 8 or 10 hours more. The express trains via the Mont-Cenis tunnel now make the run of about 440 miles in 14 hours. Allowing for the delays of which he speaks, and the longer distance by road, the Emperor made the trip in about 70 hours, at the rate of nearly 7 miles an hour." The arrival of the Emperor at Fontainebleau was so unexpected that there was no one to receive him except the concierge of the palace, an old servant named Gaillot, who had been his cook in Egypt. "Come, my good fellow," said the Emperor, "you must resume your old calling. You must get us some supper." Fortunately Gaillot had in his larder some mutton chops and some eggs, and Napoleon and Josephine ate the simple repast with a good appetite. A week later the Emperor reached St. Cloud, while the thunder of the cannon of the Invalides announced his return to the capital. The same evening, after a call on Madame Maire, the sovereigns attended the Opera, where they received a warm welcome from the audience. On the 2nd day of August, the Emperor left St. Cloud for a month's tour of inspection of the Grand Army, which was in cantonments along the Channel, prepared for a descent on England. Here, 10 days later, he received news that Admiral Villeneuve, after an indecisive action with the English fleet of Ferrol, had set sail for Cadiz instead of Brest as ordered. Losing no time in vain regrets over the failure of his well-laid plans, Napoleon called Daru to his headquarters at Pont de Brique at 4 o'clock in the morning, and dictated at one sitting the plan of the Austrian campaign as far as Vienna. In the meantime Josephine had gone to her favorite watering place, Plombières, to take the baths. What a marvelous change in her fortunes since her earlier visit as Madame Bonaparte after the departure of her husband for Egypt! Then, after her accident, she was almost alone, and Hortense was called in haste from Saint-Germain to nurse her mother. Now a company of infantry is sent to escort Her Majesty from Nancy to Plombières. There are receptions by authorities civil and military, addresses and salutes, triumphal arches at the gates of the cities. At Plombières, illuminations and fireworks. She is accompanied by a Préfet du Palais, an Écuyer d'honneur, a Dame d'honneur, and 2 Dames du Palais, 5 femmes de chambre, and a score or more of servants. The charges for the post, going and coming, amount to nearly 40,000 francs, and the entire expenses of the trip total over 134,000 francs. By way of diversion, Josephine had her portrait painted by a very popular artist named Laurent, whom she met at Plombières. For this small full-length portrait, 18 inches by 15, she paid 6,000 francs. Except for a few excursions in the neighborhood, this was the only occupation of her days. At Bondy, on her return, she was greeted by the prefect and all the authorities. She survived the addresses, and without any escort continued her journey to Malmaison, which she reached the last of August. On the 24th September, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by Josephine, Napoleon left St. Cloud to put himself at the head of the Grand Army, which exactly 4 weeks before had begun its march from the Channel to the Rhine. The journey of 315 miles to Strasbourg was made in 60 hours without any stop. In accompanying the Emperor to Strasbourg, and taking up her residence there, Josephine's thought was to escape from the Parisian addresses which bored her, from the surveillance of her brothers-in-law, and from the ennui of the Palace of St. Cloud. She was amused with the new entertainment. In the ancient capital of Alsace, Josephine lived in the episcopal mansion at the foot of the cathedral. It was a real palace, completed in 1741, and entirely modern in its appointments. Built by the first bishop of the house of Rohan, Armand Gaston, Cardinal and Grand Almoner, it had been visited by Louis XV in 1744, and had received Marie Antoinette on her arrival in France as Dauphine in 1770. Sold early in the Revolution as national property, it had been bought by the city and become the seat of the municipal administration. After the foundation of the Empire, the city had offered the palace to the state as one of the 4 imperial residences to be established at the 4 principal points of the Empire. From Boulogne, the Emperor had ordered Duroc to send Fontaine to Strasbourg to put the mansion in order to receive him. In less than 2 weeks the architect cleared out the clerks and the archives, cleaned, redecorated, and refurnished the palace, all at a cost not much exceeding 200,000 francs. Furniture was collected from the neighboring cities and chateaux. Linen, glass, and silver were sent from Paris. 3 days before the Emperor's arrival all was ready, even to the carriages and horses in the stables. The private suite of the Emperor, facing on the court, comprised 5 rooms, while in the rear, fronting on the terrace of the Ile, were the state apartments, 7 magnificent salons on the first floor. On the first and second floors there were 14 small rooms at the disposal of the Empress. The quarters were not very commodious, but she was satisfied. The Emperor remained only 4 days at Strasbourg, and then proceeded to the headquarters of the army. The life of Josephine after his departure was one continual round of dinners, balls, concerts, and spectacles. In 2 months, Beausset, the prefect of the palace, paid out over 200,000 francs for the running expenses of the household. As the success of the Emperor became known, there were visits from all of the South German princes. Josephine received the homage rendered her. She missed no ceremony. She remained until the end of all the balls she gave, and had a smile and a polite word for everyone. Not content with enjoying all the pleasures of the city, Josephine indulged to the limit her mania for spending. Everything that was offered she bought: pictures, porcelains, plants, living animals, all of which went to swell her collection at Malmaison. With the expenses of the palace, she left over 1,000,000 francs behind her in Strasbourg. The story of the campaign of 1805 is told in the letters which Napoleon wrote almost daily. From every bivouac, from every field of battle, came one of his letters, not burning and delirious as 9 years before, but full of tenderness and loving thought. To the Empress at Strasbourg, Ettlingen, 2 October 1805. I am still here and in good health. The grand manoeuvres have begun. The army of Württemberg and Baden is now united with mine. I am in a good position, and I love thee. Napoleon. Ludwigsburg, 4th October. I leave to-night. There is nothing new. The Bavarians have united with my army. I am well. In a few days I hope to have something interesting to tell you. Take care of yourself, and believe me ever yours, Napoleon. Ludwigsburg, 5th October. I leave at once to continue my march. You will be 5 or 6 days without news of me. Do not be anxious, for that is due to the operations which are about to take place. All goes well, and as I expected. Adieu, mon ami. I love and embrace thee. Napoleon. On the 6th of October the Emperor surveyed the passage of the Danube at Donauwörth, and passed the night at Nördlingen, where on the following day he issued the first of the famous bulletins of the Grand Army. He remained in this vicinity for 4 days, directing the passage of the river by the troops of Murat, and the operations which followed. He reached Augsburg on the night of the 10th, and lodged with the former Elector of Treves. To the Empress at Strasbourg, Augsburg, 10 October. I have been on the move for a week. The campaign has opened favorably. I am very well, although it has rained nearly every day. Events have moved rapidly. I am sending to France 4,000 prisoners and 8 flags, and have 14 cannon taken from the enemy. Adieu, mon ami. I embrace thee. Napoleon. 2 days later the French army entered Munich in triumph, and the Emperor continued his correspondence. To the Empress at Strasbourg, Augsburg, 12 October. The enemy is lost. Everything presages the most fortunate campaign, the shortest and most brilliant that I have ever made. I leave in an hour for Burgos. I am well, although the weather is frightful. I change my clothes twice a day. I love and embrace thee. Napoleon. On the eve of the capitulation of Ulm, from his headquarters Napoleon sent the good news to Josephine. To the Empress at Strasbourg, Erschingen, 18 October. I have accomplished my purpose. I have destroyed the Austrian army by simple marches. I have made 60,000 prisoners, taken 120 cannon, more than 90 flags, and more than 30 generals. I am going to move on the Russians. They are lost. I am content with my army. I have lost only 1,500 men, of whom 2/3 are but slightly wounded. Adieu, my Josephine. 1,000 good wishes for everybody. Napoleon. Elchingen, 21 October. I am quite well, ma bonne amie. I am just starting for Augsburg. Here 33,000 men have laid down their arms. I have from 60 to 70,000 prisoners, more than 90 flags, and 200 cannon. Never such a catastrophe in the annals of war. Take care of thyself. I am rather tired out. The weather for 3 days has been fine. Napoleon. Augsburg, 23 October. The last 2 nights have rested me, and I leave tomorrow for Munich. I long to see thee, but do not count upon my sending for thee, unless there is an armistice, or we go into winter quarters. Adieu, mon ami. 1,000 kisses. Napoleon. Munich, 27 October. I have your letter, and see with regret that you were over-anxious. I have received reports which show all the tenderness you feel for me, but you must have more strength and confidence. My health is quite good. You must not think of crossing the Rhine under 2 or 3 weeks. You must be gay. Enjoy yourself, and hope that we shall see each other before the end of the month, Brumaire. Adieu, ma bonne amie. 1,000 best wishes for Hortense, Eugène, and the 2 Napoleons. Napoleon. Hague, Niervels, 3 November. I am in the midst of a long march. The weather is very cold. The earth covered with a foot of snow, which is rather severe. Fortunately we are still in the midst of the forest, and there is plenty of wood. I am quite well, and would like to hear from you, and know that you are not anxious. Napoleon. Linz, 5 November. The weather is fine. We are 28 leagues from Vienna. I long to see you. My health is good. I embrace you. Napoleon. The Emperor of Austria, obliged to flee from his capital, had taken refuge at Brunn, where he joined the Czar and his army. On the 13th of November Napoleon entered Vienna, and took up his residence at Schönbrunn. To the Empress at Strasbourg, Vienna, 15 November. I have been here for 2 days, and am a little fatigued. I have not yet seen the city by day, but have been through it at night. Nearly all my troops are across the Danube in pursuit of the Russians. Adieu, my Josephine. I will send for you as soon as possible. 1,000 best wishes. Napoleon. The following day the Emperor sent Josephine the welcome message that he had made all the arrangements for her to proceed to Munich. End of chapters 17 and 18.